The Invaders. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Blair Buckland. The Invaders by Benjamin Ferris. Big Joe Merkelos was the first of them. He appeared at the White Bend National Bank one day, cash in hand. The charm of him, his flashing smile, the easy strength in his big body, were pervasive recommendations. But the bank's appraisal scarcely got that far. Wasn't he the first buyer in 15 years for that boneyard of lonely dreams, Dark Valley? The county seat of Wide Bend presided over 3 valleys, corresponding to the forks of the Salinook River. Once, Dark Valley had been the richest of these. Solid houses and barns stood among orchards laden with fruit, fields chock full of heavy bearded green. Till one spring, the middle fork of the river had dried up. The farmers called in specialists who sank wells and pilot holes, measured the slopes. They heard much talk about water tables, about springs undercutting rock formations. But when it was done, the fact remained. Dark Valley's water supply was choked off beyond man's ability to restore it. In the end, the farmers gave up. They left their dusty houses and shriveled orchards, and Dark Valley died. Boys hiked over there occasionally. Men scouted for fence posts or pipe. Young couples passed quickly through on moonlight nights. And at least 2 stubborn old-timers squatted at the upper end. Now that Joe Merkelos had bought it, of course, they would have to move. Well, wouldn't they? Henderson asked. Jerry Bronson looked around at the other members of the Wide Bend Businessmen's Club. Doesn't take a lawyer to answer that, Hen. Damned shame, said Corso, the barber, who always championed underdogs. They've had no equity in that land for years. The bank just let them stay on it. They can move over the hill, Jerry nodded. Maybe somebody ought to suggest that to them. Don't look at me, Corso said. Those old coots ain't been near my shop for years. When the Chuckles died, McAllister, the druggist, voiced the thought that rested unspoken on all their minds. I wonder if that fellow realizes what a worthless piece of land he's bought. He looked over it. This was Hammond of the bank. Course you didn't try to talk him out of it. Would you have? Hammond retorted indignantly. Henderson jabbed the air with his cigar. I think he was a coal miner, back east, saved up his money to get on the land. I think he's a gypsy, Carso said. You ought to know. Tipton, the grocer, laughed. Caruso got fined for his reply, and with the tinkle of coins in the luncheon club kitty, the men disappeared. Joe Merkelos's relatives arrived that night. Henderson, who told Jerry Bronson about it, had made an early morning delivery of feed nearby, and driven on to take a look at Merkelos's purchase. From the river, he viewed Dark Valley's 3 miles of width and 6 or so of length. Figures were moving about the gaunt and windowless farm buildings. At least one plow was in operation, and the good blue friendliness of smoke arose here and there. Looked like a lot of people, Jerry, but you know, I didn't see any cars or trucks around. Jerry's blue eyes crinkled. Human nature didn't like puzzles any more than it liked strangers. He returned to the tedious civil case he was working on. About 3 o'clock, he decided he was tired and bored enough to call it a day. He got into his car and headed for Dark Valley. Aside from his curiosity, he thought he might talk to the 2 old squatters at the far end. The Carvers were independent and truculent. Now that Joe Merkelos's relatives had arrived in full force, there was a danger of a clash. As the road topped the bridge, it left green fields and orchards abruptly behind. But Dark Valley had a wild sort of beauty, cupped as it was between 2 rows of hills, while curved together as higher, jumbled foothills to the west. Jerry's car trailed a plume of dust as it slid down to the dry riverbed. He made a left turn and started up the valley road. At the first farm he saw dark, plump women in billowing dresses, wearing peasant scarves over their heads. They moved about the barnyard, raking dead leaves and scratching busily at the baked earth of the old truck gardens. Chickens and ducks strayed, and Jerry caught a glimpse of the children. He waved to the group and was answered by nods and flashing smiles. Then he had a shock. One of the women was working the handle of a pump that had been bone dry for 15 years, and a slender stream of clear water spilled into her wooden tub. Somewhat dazedly, Jerry drove on. He saw more of the Merklos people at other farms. Men were working in the withered orchards. New fence posts and rails were going up. Bright axes flashed in the dry and scraggly water. Jerry's thoughts kept returning to the water in that first pump. Could it be that they had learned the valley had a supply again? That would be a mighty joke on Hammond and the First National Bank. The road, badly rutted by erosion and drifted over with sand and dry leaves, began to rise. Jerry shifted into low gear. Then suddenly, he stopped. He'd had another shock. He had just realized this road was unused. He recalled the twin ruts, patterned with rabbit and bird tracks, clear back to the turnoff. Without question, his car had been the first to mark the road since winter. Then how had these dozens of people come, with their chickens and ducks and children and tools? He had seen no cars, no wagons, no carts. How had these people come? Jerry sat back in the seat and grinned. He fished out his tobacco pouch and filled his pipe. There were times when he considered himself fairly mature, fairly well balanced. Yet he was as ready as the next to build a house of mystery out of the insubstantial timber of ignorance. Of course, there was a reasonable explanation. They must have walked from the railroad. It was a good many miles, but it was perfectly possible. Feeling better, Jerry followed the tortuous road to the western crest. His long legs hadn't taken him far from the car when he heard a harsh, "Hold up!" First one, then the other Carver brothers stepped out from a scrub oak thicket. Short, leathery old men, with ragged whiskers and dirt seamed into their faces and wrists. They eyed him malevolently over raised shotguns. "Came to talk to you," Jerry said mildly. One of them, he thought it was Ed Spat. "Ah, now," Jerry went on in an aggrieved tone, "that's a fine way to treat a son of Jack Bronson." The Carver brothers glanced at one another. Then the shotguns lowered. "Come along," they said gruffly. In the littered yard by their cabin they pointed to a bench and squatted down before it on their thin old shanks. "New people in Dark Valley?" They nodded. "They've bought it from the bank. They own it clear to the ridgeline, including your place here." "We've been here 40 years," said Ed. "If I owned it, you could stay 40 more. They send you?" The voice was sharp, suspicious. Jerry shook his head. "I just thought you'd like to know about it." For a couple of minutes the Carver brothers chewed tobacco in unison. They stood up, reached for their guns. "We'll see," they said. Jerry nodded. They walked beside him, kicking thoughtfully at the leaves. The brother named Mike rubbed his whiskers. "Get much of a look at 'em when you pass through?" "Some. They foreigners?" Jerry sighed inwardly. "Maybe. They look like hard workers." The Carver brothers cackled suddenly. "They better be, to farm that land." Jerry passed back through the valley. A man knocking out stumps waved to him. A woman in a barnyard swished out her big skirts, shooing chickens. At that first farm, a trickle of water still ran from the pump. Wide Bend was a normal community. Along with it, natural curiosity, there was a genuine feeling of neighborliness, heightened by the conviction that these hard-working strangers had thrown their money away on the hopeless venture. So one way and another, a fair percentage of the town's population found excuses in the next few days to get out to Dark Valley. Bit by bit, the reports filtered back to Jerry, and they all added up about the same. Joe Merklos and his people were incredibly industrious. Already they had cleaned up the yards, repaired sagging barns and roofless sheds. Curtains fluttered at the windows. Cows had appeared, and sheep, even a few small horses. Somehow, perhaps from accumulated seepage, they were still bringing water from the rusty pumps. And though it was surely an illusion, Dark Valley seemed to have taken on a tinge of green again. Wide Bend's women folk brought gifts of homemade preserves, jelly, canned vegetables, and came away puzzled. No, they hadn't been badly received. All was politeness and smiles. But there was, well, a sort of remoteness about these people. The kids went out of sight the minute you turned into a place, and you just couldn't get close to the grown-ups. Dark, they were, and heavy-looking. They smiled a lot, jabbering in an unknown language. They had beautiful white teeth, but no jewelry or ornaments.